and gentlemen, please be seated. Let the record reflect that we've been rejoined by all the members of our jury panel. Good morning again, ladies and gentlemen. And Mr. Scheck, I understand that you are going to address the DNA issues or physical evidence issues.
I would say.
You may proceed.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, good morning. Let me join with everybody in thanking you for your service. The frustration, the loneliness, the sacrifice you've made in this sequestration is something that we understand, or we're trying to understand. As the judge has pointed out a number of times, my colleague, Mr. Neufeld, and I, we're from New York City, more specifically, we're from Brooklyn. And we've been out here quite unexpectedly for a lot of months. And I remember when that detective from Chicago testified about having those keys that you stick in and out of the doors and little lights go on. Every day, going in and out of those doors, again and again and again, like Groundhog Day, everything repeating itself, the monotony, the loneliness, the frustration. We sit around, we talk sometimes in amazement at how you deal with this and how appreciative we are. And, well, it's just really an honor and a privilege to present this case to you. And as lawyers that dealt with some of the forensic evidence in this case, which was detailed and complicated, and I'm sure I speak for myself, Mr. Blazier, Mr. Neufeld, Mr. Clark for the prosecution, Mr. Goldberg, that we had a job. Our job was to make it simple, to make it cogent without sacrificing any meaningful detail. That's our job. And I can't tell you how appreciative we are because you paid attention, you were patient, you followed the evidence. I know that, I watched it. Now, you know, it's our job to make it simple, to make it cogent without sacrificing detail that was important. And sometimes we let you down. I know that. Some days, when we were talking about some of this, it was hard, and we came back to it again, and I think both sides tried to clarify the issues as much as we could. But you never let us down, because those were long days, but you were more than fair with us. I know you followed and paid attention to this evidence. So it is a privilege and honor to have presented that evidence to you. And I must also say that standing before you right now is a terrifying responsibility. It's a terrifying responsibility because we think the evidence shows that we represent an innocent man wrongly accused. We think the prosecution hasn't come close to meeting its burden of proof in this case beyond a reasonable doubt. And we think that the integrity of this system... I'm sorry. What is this? The integrity of this system is at stake. You cannot convict when the core of the prosecution's case is built on perjurious testimony of police officers, unreliable forensic evidence, and manufactured evidence. It is a cancer at the heart of this case, and that's what this evidence shows. When you go through it patiently, when you go through it carefully, when you go through scientifically, logically, that's what the evidence shows. And you cannot convict on that evidence. There are many, many reasonable doubts buried right in the heart of the scientific evidence in this case, and we have demonstrated them. And we don't have to prove them, but the evidence shows it. So, in the words of Dr. Lee, something is wrong. Something is terribly wrong with the evidence in this case. You cannot trust it. It lacks integrity. It cannot be a basis for a verdict of beyond a reasonable doubt. There was a logo that we showed you in the opening statements that we've reproduced here on a board, and you may recall it. It's a black hole. As you recall, it shows the evidence from Bundy, the evidence from Rockingham and the Bronco, the evidence from Mr. Simpson itself, passes through the Los Angeles Police Department, the messengers that Mr. Cochran was talking about, the lab, criminalists, coroner's office, and then it is tested by the FBI, the Department of Justice, and Selmar. And if you recall in the opening statements, we said contaminated, compromised, and corrupted, integrity of the evidence. Now, the importance of this flow chart is point number one. And you heard Dr. Cotton, Gary Sims, Dr. Gerdes, all the forensic experts told you, with respect certainly to DNA testing, all the testing, if it is contaminated, compromised, or corrupted here, it doesn't matter what the results are by these other testing agencies. Because if it happens within that black hole of LAPD, it doesn't matter how many times you test it. Ms. Clark got up there and said, well, why didn't we hear from Dr. Blake, who, if we didn't have Dr. Blake in this case to be sitting there as the testing was going on, while you were already serving on this jury panel, things were being tested. He was up there looking at what they were doing. If we didn't, we wouldn't have even known what was going on in this case. But the point is, by the time it reached the California Department of Justice and Gary Sims, if that evidence, and we've demonstrated, contaminated, compromised, and corrupted, you could do 100 tests. Dr. Blake could test it, Dr. Lee's lab could test it, everybody could test it, and you'd get the same result. So that has not been the issue in this case, and don't be distracted by that. Dr. Terry Speed, you recall him, he gave testimony in this case about error, laboratory error. And he again pointed out, he used that term common mode error. If it happens here, and that's where the evidence is compromised, contaminated, and corrupted, these results are not adding anything. So you ask the question, how did the Los Angeles Police Department, how does any laboratory become a black hole that impairs the integrity of the evidence? Can we have the first slide? Any laboratory has to have three things. You have to have rules and training, you have to have what's known as quality assurance, and you have to have chain of custody security of the evidence. Well, what have we heard about rules and training at the Los Angeles Police Department laboratory? Well, this laboratory is run without a set of rules that everyone knows. They don't even have a manual. Think about that. That's extraordinary. And then they have this draft manual. And it's ignored by the criminalists. Fung and Mazzola, they don't know what's in the draft manual, what procedures there are. And then the laboratory director, Michelle Kessler. Well, she was the acting laboratory director. Actually, one of the real problems here is that at the time of this case, the head of the laboratory was a police officer, not a scientist. But Michelle Kessler, she had that draft manual on her desk for 4 years, going through it until she says, well, some of this is no good, and they didn't get around to it. So that's how you become a black hole. The testimony is clear in this case. They did not give their criminalists training in state-of-the-art techniques. In particular, of great relevance here, there was no DNA training for the evidence collectors. Now, that's got to be a significant point. Ms. Clark told you in the opening statement that collecting, preserving bloodstain evidence for purposes of DNA testing was as simple as going into your kitchen and cleaning up spillage. Now, we all know that's not true, based on what we've heard in this case. Can we have the next slide, please? Quality assurance. That's a term that's used in bureaucracies, in hospitals, and laboratories, any place where you're trying to deliver service with integrity. What is going on here? There is a failure to document how you collect the evidence. A fundamental duty, as Dr. Lee showed you, remember with that chart? Fundamental duty of criminalists to document the evidence. In other words, where it was picked up, how it was picked up, when it was picked up. And we have seen the problems in this case when you can't do that. And you try to reconstruct it later when your memories are gone and you can't do it. Well, that's not done. And failure to document testing is tolerated. Compare the notes at the Department of Justice, Gary Sims and Renee Montgomery, with what you saw from Colin Yamauchi and Dennis Fung. I had to rearrange the notes for Colin Yamauchi, his own notes, when he was on the witness stand, and he goes, that's right. First I took out O.J. Simpson's reference sample and made the Fitzko card. Then the next thing I did was the glove. And then the next thing I did, all within that 1 hour and 20 minutes, were the Bundy blood drops. I had to reconstruct his notes for him. And then he goes, that's right. That's the way it happened. I guess that's right. I mean, it had to be when you reconstructed it all. But the notes are not there. And that's fundamental for having any integrity whatsoever. There was no serious supervision of these people. That's just clear. You saw it. This lab was not inspected. This lab is not accredited. This lab is not subjected, certainly the DNA, to external blind proficiency testing, which you know is what you need. Dr. Gerdes told you about that. Everybody talked about that. This National Research Council report, DNA Technology and Forensic Science. Can we have the next slide? Now, this is critical. Chain of custody and security. There is absolutely nothing more fundamental to preserving integrity, forensic evidence, than a chain of custody, than having security. You have to know what you're picking up. You have to be able to document it. Otherwise, bad things can happen, and nobody can trace it. In this case, they did not count the swatches when they collected them. They did not count the swatches when they got back to the laboratory and put them in the tubes for drying. They did not count the swatches when they took them out of the tubes and put them in the bindles. We don't know how many swatches they started with. They didn't book the evidence in this case for 3 days. They kept it in the least secure facility, the evidence processing room, for 3 days without being able to track the items. The lead homicide detective in this case, and we've talked it about a little, and we'll talk about it some more, is walking around with an unsealed blood vial for 3 hours. It's unheard of. The other lead detective in this case is taking shoes home. Right out of that, this could be critical evidence. The shoes that their suspect was wearing that night, taking it home. Now, You know, it was amazing when Mr. Fung testified, the extent to which, you know, they've lost all track of the rules. At one point I asked him, well, would it have been all right if they took the blood home? And he said, sure, you could put, as long as you put it in the refrigerator overnight. Do you remember that answer? I mean, there's no sense of what has to be done in order to give you reliable evidence, none. Think about the Bronco. They finished doing the collection in the Bronco, and then it's abandoned literally for 2 months. There's a box you're supposed to check off, give special care if you're going to collect it for biological evidence. Not checked off. It is sent to Vertel's. It is abandoned for 2 months. There are no records of who went in and out of that car. There was a theft. Anybody was allowed in there. And then on August 26th, they're collecting evidence from it. And then finally, and this is, could we have the next board? This is a critical point that I think demonstrates all you need to know about security and chain of custody in this laboratory. The missing lens. The missing lens. Now, this is very important evidence. This is the envelope that's found at the crime scene with the prescription glasses. If you're investigating a case, you're very concerned about this.
On this board?
No, there are not, Your Honor.
All right, thank you.
Now, we can tell, as Dr. Lee pointed out, on this lens, there are smears of blood, trace evidence. There could have been fingerprints from a perpetrator who was going into that envelope. On June 22nd, Dr. Baden and Dr. Wolf got an opportunity just to look at the evidence, not touch or examine or test, just to look. And they saw 2 lenses there. Made a note of it. February 16th, think about it. That's the first time we got a chance to inspect and just even handle the evidence. You're already sitting here, February 16th. There's something wrong. When we look at it, that lens is gone. There is no report, no record, no investigation of its disappearance. Nobody comes in and tells you what happened. Now, that tells you a lot. Did somebody take this from the laboratory as a souvenir? Did somebody walk off with this? How can that be? This is critical evidence in a case. How can that be? It just vanished down this black hole? Now they're going to say, we're Fort Knox. Nobody could get to the evidence in this case with our evidence tracking system. Now, I should just tell you in passing, I'm sure you caught it, that even when it's booked into the evidence control unit and it's supposedly being tracked, they didn't say their computer tracking system was a chain of custody system. It isn't. They'd have all the evidence item in boxes, like the sock and the blood drops, and they'll put them in the serology freezer, and they're in a box there. Then somebody will hit the computer and they can go in, and then they can take any item they want out of that box. It's not tracked by specific items. There is no good security in this system. There's plenty of access if you want to tamper with evidence. If you are authorized personnel, if you are a lead detective, if you are somebody there, it can happen. And the missing lens tells you all you need to know. What is going on here? And if they come back and say, well, maybe Dr. Baden and Wolf are wrong, there was no lens to begin with. Well, that's even weirder, isn't it? What kind of killer takes a souvenir like this? How does that fit in with their theory? The missing lens is a serious problem in this case. Now, the black hole symbolizes something else. You know, science is no better than the methods employed and the people who employ it. DNA is a sophisticated technology. It is a wonderful technology. But there's a right way to do it and a wrong way to do it. The issue in this case is not, is DNA good or bad, DNA technology? The issue is right or wrong. So Ms. Clark gets up here and tells you, well, Dr. Lee said DNA is okay, therefore the DNA evidence in this case is okay. That's ridiculous. Dr. Lee said, right way, wrong way. Dr. Lee is one of the authors of this report. Right way, wrong way. And something else. During the cross-examination of Dennis Fung and Andrea Mazzola and Mr. Matheson, we brought out a pamphlet entitled Collection of DNA Evidence, How You Should Do It. It was a pamphlet that was put together by Dr. Henry Lee in association with the FBI. Mr. Fung had only heard of it, if you recall, after he was prepared to testify in this case, not before they all went out and collected the evidence. And in that report, as it was established, and Agent Bodziak, I don't know if he really knows a lot about Dr. Lee, as he said. He had limited knowledge. I mean, he's questioning whether he goes to crime scenes. The FBI is saying, well, how do you collect DNA evidence at a crime scene? Dr. Lee writes the manual. And in that manual, they say you don't put these swatches in plastic bags. Because you put wet blood swatches in plastic bags, you're going to degrade all the DNA in them. And they sat here debating whether you could do that for months. And as we'll talk about it now, they're trying to turn that argument around. But it's just plain that they didn't know what they were doing here, and you can have the most sophisticated technology in the world, and if you don't apply it correctly, you can't trust the results. There's no compliance with the NRC report. There's no compliance with the kind of standards that you would require in a life and death situation. And this is a life and death situation. And that's what you have to demand of a laboratory. And Dr. Gerdes is a man that deals with life and death situations, bone marrow transplants, organ transplants, disease diagnosis. He came in and told you about the standards that we demand, that we require, that ought to be the minimum. They're not close. You can't brush this off, as Ms. Clark did in her arguments, by saying, sloppy criminalists, sloppy coroner. And that's all she said. I fully anticipate that most of the matters I'm going to be addressing to you, she's been planning to address in her rebuttal summation, because she certainly didn't address them in her closing argument, did she? You can't just say sloppy criminalist, sloppy coroner, big deal. She said DNA, it's an insult to your intelligence, frankly. DNA is used to identify the war dead. Therefore, accept all the evidence in this case. That doesn't answer the question, does it? As a matter of fact, the DNA test she's talking about are something they call mitochondrial DNA tests. It has nothing to do with the tests in this case. And the war dead has nothing to do with what was going on in this case. Zero. It's not an answer. It's not this case. It's not the techniques. They argue that defense has to prove exactly how, exactly where, exactly when tampering occurred with any of this evidence. That's not our burden. They have to prove to you that this evidence has integrity beyond a reasonable doubt. And you know, when people tamper with evidence, they don't do it on videotape. They try to do it with some stealth. They try to cover their tracks. And as Mr. Cochran's pointed out, and if you think about this evidence, it wouldn't take more than 2 bad police officers to do this. And a lot of people look the other way. Could we have 2.01? Now, the way that I'd like to organize the rest of my remarks for you is a systematic study of the essential facts. And the circumstantial evidence charge in this case talks about, key point, each fact which is essential to complete a set of circumstances necessary to establish the defendant's guilt must be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Each essential fact. That's what's special about a circumstantial evidence case. For each essential fact, they have to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. If they fail, if there's a reasonable doubt about an essential fact, you must acquit. Those are the rules. And when you're looking at a piece of circumstantial evidence, if it is susceptible of 2 reasonable interpretations, one points to guilt, one points to innocent, you must adopt the one that points to innocence. Can we have the next chart? So what I propose to do with you today, and I'll try to do it as quickly as I possibly can, is go through what we believe are essential facts. Now, we don't have to prove anything. And we don't have the burden of proof here. And I'm going to confront each and every one of these essential pieces of evidence in this case and raise a reasonable doubt about it, more than a reasonable doubt, many reasonable doubts. But if they fail in one of their essential facts, you have to acquit. We're going to go through the socks. Another reason I put this up here is that you'll know when I'm getting close to done, and you can follow along. The socks, the stains on the back gate, the missing blood, the hair and fiber, the evidence of struggle at Bundy, the testimony of Dr. Baden and Dr. Lee, the Bronco, the Rockingham glove. That's what we'll be discussing this morning. Let's start with the sock. We know that on June 13th, when Mr. Fung went to collect the sock, not yet, he saw it on the throw rug, not yet, and he did not see blood. He did not see soil on the carpet. He did not see any trace evidence around, not on the stairwell, not on the carpet leading into the bedroom, not anywhere. There's supposedly a stain, an ankle stain, on these socks. You saw it cut out, about 1.5 inches, huh? More DNA in that than anything in this case. Wouldn't that, if it were there, have left a transfer, some specks, something? If they're in a struggle? You have children. I have children. You ever see them go out to play in dirt, like that closed-in area at Bundy? Get into some kind of ruckus, socks come back, they're filthy. Would have to be here if there's anything on them at all. Nothing. Nothing there. Now, Mr. Fung is looking for blood. These socks are the only clothing they take. It's logical as a criminalist, as he admitted on cross-examination, that he would be looking at the ankle area, the one they would look to first because that would be the most likely exposed. He sees nothing. He's running around trying to do testing of anything that looks like blood. No test of the socks. Then, on June 22nd, Dr. Baden and Dr. Wolf are permitted to go to the crime lab. And Michelle Kessler shows them the socks. They see nothing. Now, we get to June 29th. This is very interesting. On June 29th, the defense wanted access to samples, split them. And the criminalists, Matheson, Kessler, the head of the laboratory, and Yamauchi, are going through all the evidence in about a 5 or 6 hour period. Right there, they're going through all the evidence to make an assessment of what kind of testing could be performed, of what kind of biological material or blood would be on any of these pieces of evidence, to see PCR testing, RFLP testing, how they could be divided. They also, Mr. Yamauchi said, they were literally measuring the size of the swatches and making assessments and making examinations. What piece of evidence at that point is more important to these people than the socks found in Mr. Simpson's bedroom? Wouldn't you look at that? And they told us that they took white paper and they put the socks on the white paper, and if there's blood, 1.5 inches on that ankle, You saw it every time that we put something down. Little specks would come off. Even when Miss Clark put those gloves on the very first day, we actually had it on white paper, used the plastic gloves, and little pieces of trace fell off. And we actually pulled those together, put them in a separate exhibit, because these kinds of things fall off. If there were that stain on the sock, that big stain on the sock, they would have seen it. Gary Sims told you. He was disturbed by it, that a trained criminalist should have seen it. You use light that's sufficient to look at what you're doing. They're now telling you we didn't have light, we didn't look at what we were doing. Please. Where I come from, that don't pass the laugh test. Now, what is the summary? On the socks, on the report they do on June 29th, dress socks, blood search, none observed. None observed. Tells you all you need to know. Or none obvious, I'm sorry. Can't even read that. It's either none observed or none obvious. They have two different phrases, one on the handwritten report, one on the typewritten report. Okay. Then suddenly on August 4th, Mr. Yamauchi can't remember. It was some kind of general inventory. Mr. Matheson might have asked him. He can't remember what the direction was. It wasn't specific to the sock. Somebody said, go look at this stuff. And then, for the first time, they find the stain on the ankle. Now, we have evidence of the wet transfer, going through surface 1, surface 2, through the little holes in the sock to surface 3. It's pretty simple. If there's a leg in those socks, you can't have the transfer. Professor McDonald and Dr. Lee came in, and they showed you the pictures of the little red balls. And I don't think it's even being seriously contested that this is evidence of a wet transfer now. They're not contesting it, really. Can't get it when the leg's in the sock. Their testimony stands unrefuted. There was no bloodstain expert that came in here and said, that's not a wet transfer, Dr. Henry Lee, Professor McDonald. Dr. DeForest didn't show up here. Why? Now, during the course of cross-examination of Dr. Lee and Professor McDonald, the prosecution sent up some hypothetical explanations for this that I'll review with you. And each one of them was rejected by Dr. Lee, Professor McDonald, but Dr. Lee in particular, as I recall, I think they gave him all of them, as highly improbable. Lots of things are possible, but he said these explanations were highly improbable. Number one, the idea that at the time of the killings, there could have been a touch with the finger from a victim of Mr. Colbrand Simpson on the leg, and that it wasn't dry when Mr. Simpson somehow got into that Bronco, came back to Rockingham, avoided Allen Park, ran down the side, left no blood stains, hit the air conditioner, hit the stucco fence, leaving no trace, somehow came in, all with the bloody clothes, went up the stairs, left no trace of blood, left no trace of soil, left no trace of berries, got into the house, took off the socks, left them there, and then it's still wet. So if it's still wet when he takes off the socks, you get the transfer to surface 3. Well, there's a big problem with that. Then you should have seen something on the carpet if that's what happened. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit. Then the next explanation is on August 4th, when Mr. Yamauchi did the pheno test, taking the swab and brushing the stain to see if it were blood, that that somehow created wetness that transferred into the third surface. Or, well, Dr. Lee and Dr. McDonald said that that doesn't make sense when you look at the stains, because if that brushing had occurred, you would see a diffusion. And you don't see that kind of diffusion, and that's not the way you would do the test anyhow. Just touch it. Couldn't cause that kind of transfer through to surface 3. Highly improbable, said the leading forensic scientists in America. Sweat. Next explanation is going to be sweat. Well, there was a stain from the crime scene, but sweating in the sock, and then the sock is taken off, and then somehow by process of sweat, it transfers to surface 3. Dr. Lee and Dr. McDonald said, ridiculous, highly improbable. You'd see that same diffusion as with the phenotest, and we don't see it. The next explanation. When Mr. Simpson is taking off the socks, he coincidentally has a finger that touches surface 3 opposite the ankle stain. So it's not Nicole Brown Simpson's blood that is on surface 3. It's Mr. Simpson's own blood that he accidentally touched exactly opposite. That's a ridiculous coincidence. That doesn't pass the lab test. That's the other explanation they floated. Then another explanation they tried. They showed Dr. Lee the new picture of the sock. Remember how they were folded up? They said, well, maybe blood of Mr. Simpson's, when you fold the sock over, landed on surface 3 coincidentally opposite the stain when they were bundled up, and that's what created it. Again, rejected as a ridiculous, highly probable coincidence. Now, none of these things make sense. Ms. Clark also said, you know, there's a tiny spatter of Mr. Simpson's, some blood at the top of the socks, Mr. Simpson. She says, well, there's spatter there. Well, you know, Professor McDonald said there's no spatter. Gary Sims doesn't pretend to be a bloodstain expert. Professor McDonald, Dr. Lee, the leading experts in this area. They didn't bring in anybody. It's ridiculous to say there's spatter there. And if it's spatter of O.J. Simpson's blood, how does that happen? What, did he bleed so much that created a puddle and spatter on the top of the socks? Nonsense. The point is, every explanation that they're desperately trying to come up with is a highly improbable inference. The most likely and probable inference is the one that is not for the timid or the faint of heart. Somebody played with this evidence, and there's no doubt about it. And you know why there's no doubt about it? Because they got so upset in the opening statement about the socks, about the back gate, so upset that they sent it to the FBI. And Mr. Harmon wrote them a letter saying, please refute the defense theory that somebody tampered with this evidence. Please refute it. Those were the words. Not exactly an objective way of sending it out. Please test this for EDTA. Please refute what the defense has to say. And Agent Martz never testified in the prosecution's case. And you know why that is? And that's really all you need to know. Because he couldn't refute it. Because it's an inference consistent with innocence that they can't refute. There's EDTA. How does that happen? There's EDTA there. So if we could have slide 4. The sock. No blood on June 13th when it's collected. No blood on June 22nd when Dr. Lee, Dr. Baden, and Dr. Wolf see it. They looked for blood on June 29th on a lab paper with reasonable light. 3 people with 25 years of experience, and they don't see it. Most important piece of evidence, examining it for purposes of court. The wet transfer to surface 3, unrefuted, and EDTA. Now let's think about it. Is this coincidence? Kill that, please. Is this coincidence all these things with the sock? Or is it corroboration? I say it's corroboration that something is wrong. Something is terribly wrong with the most important pieces of evidence in this case. It is a cancer that is infecting the heart of this case. You cannot render a verdict beyond a reasonable doubt based on evidence like this. So if we apply 2.01, an essential fact, the socks, Ms. Clark said, an essential fact, whose interpretation is the most reasonable? And even if you give some of those cockamamie explanations some credence, and you say, well, maybe ours is certainly reasonable enough for you to, you must adopt it. And if you must adopt it, really, where does that leave us? Because, you know, there's another instruction that I submit has some relevance here. Can we have the slide now? Now, you've been instructed that a witness who is willfully false in one material part of his or her testimony is to be distrusted in others. You may reject the whole testimony of a witness who has willfully testified falsely as to a material point, unless from all the evidence you believe the probability of truth favors his or her testimony in other particulars. Thank you. Now, yes, that applies to witnesses, but I would argue to you that by analogy, it applies to the messengers who are bringing you this forensic evidence as well. Because let's just think about the socks. The LAPD officers and lab people who are responsible for the collection of this, for the chain of custody, for preserving the integrity of this evidence are the same people that are bringing you everything else. Remember what Dr. Lee said about the socks? He said it's like eating a plate of spaghetti. Looking through the bowl of spaghetti, I think he said, you see a cockroach. Do you then take every strand of that bowl of spaghetti to look for more cockroaches, or you just throw it away and eat no more? In your deliberations, somebody may say, all right, I have a reasonable doubt about this essential piece of evidence, the socks. I have a reasonable doubt. It's reasonable that they manufactured this piece of evidence. But let's put that aside and look at everything else. Well, just wait a second. Just think about what that means. If they manufactured evidence on the sock, how can you trust anything else? How, in this country, in this democracy, can they come in? There's no doubt Furman's a liar and a genocidal racist. There's no doubt about that. But there's really no doubt either that they played with this sock, is there? And if that can happen, that's a reasonable doubt for this case, period. End of sentence. End of case. It really is true. Not in this country. It's a test of citizenship, not in this country. Now let's go to the back gate. Can we have the next slide? Because, you know, there's more. There's more of this cancer. We don't have the rest of that? Put it all up. 117, put it all up, Howard. 117 was the stain taken from the back gate. And you know, there was something very strange about it, wasn't there? The blood drops at Bundy were degraded and had extremely low DNA concentrations. 117 had enough for an RFLP test. It was 27 times as much as 47, the first blood drop, 45 times as much as 48, 270 times as much as 49, 51 times as much as 50, 11 times as much as 52. This slide, like most of them I'm going to show you, is in evidence. And you know who brought us that testimony? Gary Sims from the Department of Justice. We have the next slide? That's 117, the one on the gate. Do them all. This is 115 and 116, the one on the lower parts of the gate. 15 times as much as 47, 22 times as much as 48, 135 times as much as 49, 25 times as much as 50, 6 times as much as 52. This supposedly has been out there from June 12th to July 3rd. And until that, there's no question. Sunlight degrades DNA. Moisture and bacteria degrade DNA. Why are these concentrations so much higher? And another point. There's DNA concentrations, but there's also a separate test, as you've learned, when you look at those yield gels for degradation. These samples are not degraded. How can that be? Nothing. Now, there's something interesting here, too. The prosecution is now saying, well, it's on a different surface than the Bundy blood drops. Bundy blood drops are on cement. This is on a metal gate, painted metal gate. So something magical about this that will prevent it from degrading at all in over 3 weeks. Remember, the blood drop number 50 is just a few feet from this bottom portion of the gate that's very, very close to the surface and all the same environmental insults. But you know what proves this argument totally fallacious? And I asked this question of Gary Sims, and you can go back. Remember the blood from the handrail? That was one of the last questions I asked him. It's very curious to me that they've never typed that. They're still testing. Remember the blood on the handrail as you're leading up Bundy. Same kind of surface. Totally degraded. Remember the samples from the front gate? There was blood on the front gate. Gary Sims's testimony, no question about that, severely degraded, just like the other samples from Bundy. So those are the same kinds of surfaces. So this explanation, don't pass the laugh test. Well, what's the other explanation that Ms. Clark offered you? Now, this is a whopper. She said, well, it's the plastic bags. I mean, that's rich. They spent weeks trying to deny that putting samples in plastic bags doesn't degrade the DNA. Well, it does. I mean, you know that from the moisture. So now they're saying, on July 3rd, when Fung made this collection, he put these swatches in a plastic bag, but he didn't let them cook as long in a truck as he did on June 12th. It's our own incompetence. That's the explanation. That accounts for these differences. Well, you know, that doesn't work either for a number of reasons. Number one, they were going, as you recall, on a tour of the crime scene. And Fung, apparently right away, all of a sudden, they found this stuff on the back gate. And there's no testimony, zero, as to how long it took Dennis Fung to bring those back to the evidence processing room, or how long he had them in a plastic bag, or what other things they had him doing. There's no testimony that he immediately went back to the lab. He didn't continue with them in the tour or anything like that. And you know why it's significant that they can't come in here and argue that when they don't present evidence? Because they could have. Because we know that there are records of when you go back into that evidence processing room and get in the door, they could have demonstrated, if they really want to put this argument before you, they could have demonstrated how long it took. Or they could have brought him back here to testify about it. But frankly, if they brought him back here to testify about that explanation so late in the game, you wouldn't have believed him, would you? So they can't use this plastic bag theory, and they can't use that it's a different surface. They can't. It doesn't make sense scientifically. It doesn't fit. So what's going on here? Now, there's another thing. They're going to say, well, you know, Officer Risky, Phillips, I believe, Furman, Rossi, that night, when they were entering the premises, the back gate, they had their flashlights. And they were looking up and down, and they think they saw some blood on the back gate. So they all testify to it, so you know it's there. Well, first of all, we know, you've been there, that this gate was rusting. There were all kinds of darknesses, imperfections. There were berries all over there. There's all kinds of discolorations. And what did they really see with their flashlights? It's not clear what they saw with their flashlights. But you know what's very, very interesting is that Lang said to Fung, go look. There's blood on the back gate. You should go look. Or we've heard reports there's blood on the back gate. Now, this is very interesting. Could we put up the diagram? You may remember this. This is the diagram that Fung did of the back gate. Pull back on it. And you'll recall the testimony. These are the numbers you see, 115, 116, all those numbers, right? Those are the photo numbers. You recall how they did the collection? That they put down a photo number, not the evidence item number. So they started on the walkway with 112, and they put down 112, and that was sample 47, and they collected that. Then they went and they put down number 113, and that was sample 48, and they collected that. Then they went down and they put down 114, and that was sample 49, and they collected that. Then they put down 115, and that was sample 50, and now we're right by the back gate, and they collected that. Now, this is what shows you there was no blood on the back gate. Because at that point, what do? They go to the front gate. They walk all the way back to the front gate where the bloodstain patterns are. That's 116. And then they go back all the way to the end of the driveway and they get the last blood drop, number 52, 117. Why did they go all the way back? I'll tell you why. Because Detective Lang had told Mr. Fung as he testified that there was blood on the back gate. And they looked, he'd heard reports of it, and they didn't see any blood on the back gate. So the only blood they saw on a gate was on the front gate. So they went back and collected 116. And you know what else shows you that? Can we have the picture? Where is it, Mr. Fung? They took no pictures of any blood on the back gate 117. There's some discoloration there that may be consistent with 115 if it's blood at all, but there is no 116. So there's no pictures either. Thank you. And what else? What else? What else? There's EDTA on the stains from the back gates. So can we have a chart on this? Let's look at the back gate. No documentation or photos on June 13th. Discovered on July 3rd. High DNA concentration. No degradation. EDTA. Coincidence or corroboration that something is wrong. Something is terribly wrong. There is a cancer at the heart of this case. This is a reasonable doubt. You put this together with the sock. How many cockroaches do you have to find in the bowl of spaghetti? This isn't made up. This isn't invented. These are facts. How could all of this be? How can, this is a reasonable interpretation of the evidence based on solid fact. You cannot, on your oath, reject this and say, it never happened. You can't. It's a reasonable doubt. Now let's discuss EDTA, because that's obviously an important issue. They asked for the tests to be done after the opening statement. Refuted. And they didn't put them on because it doesn't refute. Reasonable interpretation of the evidence that there's EDTA there, consistent with having come from a purple top tube, on the face of it. They didn't put them on. We had to call them. But you know, there's a very, very interesting point that you might have missed in Dr. Reeder's testimony when we compare Dr. Reeder's and Agent Marks. And that is, in January, there was a gentleman named Henkhaus, works with the LAPD Science Division. And they were interested, after the opening statement, in seeing whether or not tests could be performed